I'd like to say that we're focused on life-changing education, transformational education. And I think a good education changes what you know, which is a good thing, but a great education changes who you are, which may be completely transformative. So education changed my life, and I'd like to tell you just a little about this. So I began life being born into a farming family in the middle of California, where all of my family on both sides were farmers. I think today something around 2% of the population are in farming. But I went to a public high school, which was quite rural, not very rigorous, and I did very well. And because of the master plan in the state of California, if you graduate in the top 1/8 of your high school class, you're guaranteed a spot on one of the campuses at the University of California. So I thought, hey, this is cool. I'm going to be, an astronaut. And I got in and I went to the University of California without realizing how unprepared I was. It actually wasn't until only a few years ago that I figured this out. So I didn't know that there was an SAT until like a couple months before you had to go. And they said, you go take this test, and I did. Turns out, don't tell anybody. It's embarrassing as a college president. But my SAT scores were almost 400 points below the median at Olin. So I would not have gotten an interview. I wouldn't have been at Candidates Weekend. But blissfully ignorant, I showed up at the University of California. I was the luckiest guy on the planet, because the first person with a PhD that I met and the first engineer that I met was my undergraduate mentor, Dr. Melvin Ramey, okay? He was not just a teacher, he was also a coach, which I also didn't know at the time. In fact, a coach of some note. He is an Olympic track and field coach and has had some of his mentees win gold medals in the Olympics. So he knew how to build growth mindset into people. And that's what he did with me. So, in fact, I have known him for more than 40 years. He has been a mentor throughout my entire life, and he actually just passed away about a year ago from brain cancer. But just to illustrate that how close that relationship has been, Mel's widow, Dr. Felicine Ramey, and his daughter, is here in the audience today. And I'm wondering if they would stand up briefly, just because I'm so grateful to them. Can you bring the lights up? There they are, here in the front. And I'm sure Mel would be really proud of his daughter. Dinah Ramey Berry is a distinguished professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. So Mel was my mentor, my first mentor, and he made it possible for me to get through school. In fact, without even realizing that I wasn't prepared. So many things I learned from him have been fundamental to understanding what education is about. By his example, I realized that every time you walk into a classroom and you pick up a piece of chalk, you're not just teaching calculus. You're shaping a mindset. You may not know it, and you may not be deliberately planning to do this, but you're doing it every single time. And also by his example, I learned that hopeful faculty members spread hope among their students. And cynical faculty members spread cynicism. Has anybody here ever met a cynical faculty member? Okay. Have you ever met a cynical entrepreneur? You haven't, because that's an oxymoron. Okay? So there may be some things that we need to do in education. A little later on, after leaving UC Davis at that point, I wound up going to MIT and then to Caltech, and I did all these studies in science and engineering. And I had a reason later in my life to actually engineer something. This was because the salaries were quite low and I needed to supplement my income, so I wound up doing some consulting work. And then I found out what engineers actually do. So note to self, what we teach is not necessarily what people need. I got involved in a very interesting project working for a company called Astro Research Corporation. We were designing very large deployable spacecraft. This one particular problem was to design something called a heliogyro. What is this thing? This is a helicopter that flies in the solar wind in order to chase Halley's Comet. So not many people do this, okay? That was the most frustrating thing I think I've ever done. The thing, by the way, has 12 blades, helicopter blades. Each blade is 7 miles long. It self-deploys from the cargo bay. It takes it a month or so to get deployed, spinning, and then it follows this satellite. Getting the technical details to work out with that was very frustrating. It took a couple of years. Nothing that I learned at Caltech or at MIT or at the University of California was helpful, okay? What I began to realize, in fact, we had to hire an origamist from Japan to help us think about how you fold up 7 miles of this stuff so that it will not snatch on something when it's unfolding. And we found out that the most helpful people were a group of technicians in the shop who had a high school education but had years of experience in actually making things. So guess what? All that math is not necessarily the most important thing to getting the right answer. Design is a process that doesn't become obsessed with mathematics. That became really a market point in my life. And then, of course, later on, I got involved in Olin College, which is an interesting place. If you don't know anything about it, it's kind of like a national laboratory for STEM education redesign. So we have a mission, and the mission is to rethink what it means to be an engineer and rethink what it means to be educated in the 21st century. And one of the things we found out is the role of people, that people are necessary to change lives, that a great education that changes who you are has to touch identity, agency, and purpose. So at Olin, we, because of our interest in design, have a program where every student completes 25, roughly, design-build exercises in a team before they graduate. And many of them actually experiment with starting a business or starting some kind of an enterprise. And they also get an accredited engineering degree, and they go off and become engineers. This is really quite a different sort of experience. The teamwork. In fact, students are telling us that one of the most important ingredients in developing these teams is what they would call the marriage counselor, okay? How do you get along with each other? And in fact, a multidisciplinary team, people who are a sociologist from Wellesley College or an MBA from Babson, is a really important ingredient to getting the right answer. So we've become convinced, and I want to ask the audience for one thing about this, that people are the way you connect with the world. It's how you change lives, and it's really the key to understanding with your heart, not just your head. If you are a scientist or an engineer, would you raise your hand? See, there's a lot of us in this audience, right? Let me ask you a question. When you took thermodynamics, strength of materials, electric circuits, how many stories about people did you see in the book? Okay. Not very many, right? We've done a terrific job in engineering schools of eliminating people from everything that we talk about. And then when you read what happens in learning science, it's always about stories about people. When I finish in about 1 minute and leave, you will probably remember what I said, not because of the sound bites, but because it's connected to the context of my life. That's how people remember things. You need to connect them to identity, agency, and purpose. I hope you'll remember as you go through today, this is an experiment, okay? We've never done this. I keep getting this image in my head of the first time we tried to launch a rocket in the 1960s. It didn't wind up in orbit. So I hope you'll take that into account as you watch what we do and help us to learn from it. I hope it helps you think differently about how education can change lives. Thank you very much, and welcome to our conference.